3 days before my wedding, I watched my father's face go from smug to ghost white over a single cup of coffee. He came shuffling into the kitchen in his worn slippers, rubbing his neck the way he always did when he thought the world owed him a quiet morning. The smell of fresh coffee hit him first. Then the sight of breakfast set neatly for two at the old oak table he'd had since before I was born. Bacon, eggs, toast, orange juice, the kind of breakfast he always said a good daughter made for her father. He stopped in the doorway, took it all in, and I could feel his eyes on the back of my head. I was standing at the counter pretending to rinse a mug, my cheek still tender from where his hand had landed the night before. "Well," he said, his voice low and satisfied. "Looks like you finally remembered your place." I didn't turn around. I didn't say a word. For a second, the only sounds were the ticking wall clock and the faint sizzle of bacon grease cooling in the skillet. I could feel his pride filling the room like smoke, thick and stale. Then he saw who was sitting at the table. The scrape of his slippers stopped. Silence stretched out behind me. Then a sharp inhale, short, startled, almost like a man who'd stepped on a live wire. "What?" His voice cracked slightly. "What are you doing here?" My fiancé didn't raise his voice. He didn't even stand up. He just looked at my father with calm, steady eyes and said, "Good morning, sir. We need to talk about last night." That was the moment my father realized the slap he'd given me at dinner wasn't going to disappear into the walls of this house like so many other things he'd rather forget. I remember gripping the edge of the counter, my stomach tight, my heart pounding in my ears. I had spent my whole life hiding the worst parts of my father from the rest of the world. But that morning, with my wedding 3 days away and Marcus sitting at that table, I knew I couldn't protect him anymore. Not from the truth. And not from himself. If you had told me a year earlier that I'd be standing in my childhood kitchen watching my father come face to face with the consequences of his own temper, I would have laughed it off. My dad was the kind of man people in town respected. He'd been a firefighter for 30 years in our small Midwestern town, the kind of guy who pulled strangers out of burning cars and taught kids about smoke alarms at the elementary school. He shook hands firm, looked people in the eye, and always knew the right thing to say at church potlucks and little league games. But that wasn't the man I grew up with behind closed doors. The man I knew came home with smoke still in his hair and something hard in his eyes, something he never talked about. Over time, after a back injury forced him into early retirement, that hardness settled in and made a home in him. The less he worked, the more he drank. The more he drank, the more he talked about respect, as if it were something people owed him just for breathing. I learned early on that silence was safer than arguing. My mother used to smooth things over, laughing too loudly at his jokes, stepping in when his voice got too sharp. When she died from a sudden stroke 8 years ago, it was like someone had taken the last bit of softness out of our house. It was just me and Dad after that, orbiting around each other, careful not to bump too hard. By the time I turned 30, I'd built a life outside those walls. I worked as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long shifts, listening to heart monitors and wheelchairs squeaking down the hall. I'd gotten used to being the calm one in a crisis, the steady hands and gentle voice when families were falling apart. At work, people told me I had a gift. At home, Dad told me I thought too highly of myself. Then I met Marcus. We met in the one night when he brought in a witness from a federal building across town. At first, all I knew was that he worked in government. He was quiet, serious, but there was a warmth in his smile that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't until months later that I learned the details of what he did. Details I won't repeat here for his sake and mine. I'll just say this: he was trained to read people, to notice the things others missed, and to keep his voice level when the stakes were high. My father didn't know any of that. To him, Marcus was just the guy from the city who was probably soft and didn't understand real work. The first time they met, Dad crushed Marcus's hand in one of those old man tests, searching for weakness. Marcus didn't flinch. He just smiled and asked my father how long he'd been retired from the fire department. He'd done his homework. From that day on, there was a silent standoff between them. Dad poked and prodded, looking for a reason not to approve. Marcus stayed polite, never rising to the bait, but I could see the way his jaw tightened when Dad talked over me or dismissed my opinions. All of that led to the night of the slap. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, just the three of us at the old oak table, going over last-minute wedding details. The house smelled like pot roast and onions, the kind of meal my mom used to make. I'd hoped, foolishly, that the familiar food might soften Dad, make him remember the better parts of himself. Instead, it was like every bitterness he'd been carrying chose that night to come spilling out. We were talking about the ceremony. Marcus suggested we keep the speeches short so guests could enjoy the reception. Dad had other ideas. I'm her father, he said, voice already edged with that dangerous tone I knew too well. I'll speak as long as I damn well please. Of course, Marcus said calmly. I just meant. I know what you meant. Dad jabbed his fork toward Marcus. You want to control everything. This whole wedding, it's your show, isn't it? Dad, I said carefully, we're planning it together. Planning? He let out a harsh laugh. You're doing what he wants. Just like you always do. Running off to the city, working late shifts so you don't have to come home, choosing him over your own blood. My chest tightened. That's not fair. Fair? His voice rose. I gave you everything. I raised you alone after your mother died. And this is the thanks I get? You marrying some government suit who thinks he's better than us? Marcus's expression didn't change, but I saw his hands still on the table. Dad, that's enough. Don't tell me what's enough. He slammed his glass down, water sloshing over the rim. You're my daughter. You live under my roof when it suits you, eat my food, and then you disrespect me in front of this. Sir, Marcus said quietly, but firmly. Emma hasn't disrespected you. Dad's face went red. You don't get to tell me what my daughter has or hasn't done. I'm not telling you anything, Marcus replied, still calm. I'm asking you to lower your voice and speak to her with respect. That was when Dad snapped. He stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Respect? You want to talk to me about respect? Before I could react, before Marcus could move, my father's hand shot across the table and caught me across the cheek. The sound cracked through the kitchen like a gunshot. I froze. My face stung, hot and sharp. The room tilted for a second, and all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and my father's ragged breathing. Marcus was on his feet instantly, but he didn't lunge. He didn't shout. He just stood there, every muscle coiled tight, his eyes locked on my father with an expression I'd never seen before, cold, controlled fury. Emma, Marcus said softly, not taking his eyes off Dad. Are you okay? I touched my cheek, feeling the heat bloom under my fingers. I'm fine. No, Marcus said, you're not. Dad seemed to realize what he'd done. His hand dropped to his side, his face draining of color. I didn't, she provoked. Get out, Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through everything. This is my house. Get out. Marcus stepped between me and my father, his posture protective but not threatening. You need to leave. Now. For a long moment, Dad just stood there, breathing hard, looking between us like he was trying to figure out how things had gotten so out of control. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket and walked out the back door. The slam echoed through the house. Marcus turned to me immediately, his hands gentle as he tilted my face toward the light to examine my cheek. Emma, we need to talk about this. It was he's just stressed about the wedding. No. Marcus's voice was firm but not harsh. This isn't about stress. This isn't about the wedding. This is about your father hitting you, and we are not pretending it didn't happen. Tears burned behind my eyes. Marcus, please. I love you, he said, cupping my uninjured cheek. And I will not watch someone hurt you and do nothing. Not even your father. That night, I cried in Marcus's arms while he held me on the couch. He didn't push me to make decisions. He didn't threaten or rage. He just held me and listened while I finally told him things I'd never said out loud. About the years of walking on eggshells. About the way Dad's anger had gotten worse after Mom died. About the guilt I carried for wanting my own life away from him. Tomorrow morning, Marcus said quietly when I finally ran out of words, we're going to have a conversation with your father. A real one. What are you going to do? I asked, fear and hope tangled together. I'm going to give him a choice, Marcus said. To be the father you deserve, or to lose you entirely. And that was how we ended up here. At the kitchen table, with breakfast for two, and my father standing in the doorway, staring at Marcus like he'd just realized he was in over his head. My father didn't speak for several seconds, and in that silence, something inside him shifted. I'd seen him angry, I'd seen him stubborn, I'd seen him downright cruel. But I had never seen him afraid. Not like this, not standing barefoot in his own kitchen, staring at a man who didn't raise his voice, didn't posture, didn't puff up his chest. A man who simply sat there with a steady gaze, waiting for him to sit down. I watched Dad's throat bob as he swallowed, his eyes darting to me, then back to Marcus. His bravado thinned like breath on glass. What's this about? Dad finally said. It came out rougher than he meant, but not confident, more like a man hoping his tone might hide his nerves. Marcus didn't move, didn't even touch his coffee. Sir, he said calmly, please sit. It was the same tone I'd heard him use in hospital hallways when a panicked family member was about to do something foolish. Quiet authority, not threatening, just immovable. Dad sank slowly into the chair across from him, the one that still had his old burn mark on the armrest from when he dropped a cigarette in '98. Suddenly, he looked older than I'd ever seen him. Softer, smaller, almost. I turned from the counter and leaned back against it, crossing my arms. My cheek still burned, the bruise beginning to bloom under the skin. I watched him notice it, watched his eyes flicker, not with guilt, not yet, but with the shock of seeing proof on my face. "You two planned this?" he asked. "No," I said. My voice was steady even though my hands were cold. "I told Marcus what happened. He came on his own." Dad's face tightened. Shame, irritation, fear, they all passed over him in one messy wave. "You didn't need to." "I did," Marcus said quietly. "Because Emma spent last night crying in my arms. Because she's been protecting you for years. And because what you did crossed a line you don't get to uncross." Dad opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself, maybe to blame the whiskey, maybe to bring up respect again, but Marcus cut in before the excuses could form. "Sir," he said, "I didn't come here to threaten you." Dad blinked. "Then why are you here?" "Because I needed to look you in the eye and make sure you understood what you did. Not as a father, as a man." Dad's eyebrows drew together, and for a second he tried to summon the old fire. "I raised her," he snapped. "I took care of her." You hit her," Marcus said simply. 3 days before your daughter's wedding. You struck her in anger." Silence fell again, heavy and suffocating. Dad's jaw clenched. "She disrespected me." I let out a breath, tired down to my bones. I'd heard those words my entire adult life. Words my mother had smoothed over with practiced smiles and gentle distractions. But Mom wasn't here anymore. And I was too old and too tired to play that role in her place. "She didn't disrespect you," Marcus said softly. "She disagreed with you." Dad pushed back from the table slightly, as if the distinction had stung. "Same thing." "No," Marcus replied, shaking his head. "It's not." His voice was calm, but something in it made even the kitchen feel smaller. My father studied Marcus carefully, really seeing him for the first time. Not just as some city boy. Not just as the fiancé. But as a man with a spine of steel wrapped in quiet courtesy. "What exactly do you do?" Dad finally asked, suspicion dripping from each word. Marcus paused. "Not long. Just enough to make the moment breathe." "I work in federal service," he said simply. Dad's eyes narrowed. "Law enforcement?" Marcus didn't confirm. He didn't deny. He didn't need to. Something in his posture, still, poised, absolutely unshakable, told my father everything he needed to know. And maybe more. Dad looked away, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the coffee mug but didn't touch it. "So what, you going to turn me in?" he muttered. Marcus leaned forward slightly, but his voice remained as steady as sunrise. "No, sir, that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I love your daughter, and because I'm about to become part of this family." Dad flinched at the word family, but Marcus continued. "I'm giving you an opportunity to choose who you want to be in her life moving forward." My father stared down at the table, at the breakfast he'd assumed was some quiet apology. His fingers brushed the fork, then withdrew. I watched him wrestle with something inside himself. Pride, regret, habit, fear, all of them tangled. "Wedding's in 3 days, Marcus said. I want you there. She wants you there. But not like this." I looked at Marcus then. Really looked. His profile was steady, his expression gentle but firm. I realized how much strength it took not to hate my father. Not to lash out, not to take control. He wasn't here to punish. He was here to draw a line and offer a hand. Dad licked his lips, then looked at me. "You want me there?" he asked, voice cracking just a little. "I do," I said honestly. "But not if you're going to tear me down on the most important day of my life. Not if you're going to treat Marcus like an enemy. And not if you're going to pretend last night didn't happen." Dad's eyes glistened, barely, almost imperceptible. But I saw it. The first crack in the wall he'd built since my mother died. He looked away again. "I don't know how to fix all this," he whispered, almost too soft to hear. Marcus leaned back. "Then start small. Start by saying you were wrong." Dad's shoulders tightened. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't speak. I wasn't sure which way he'd go. Apology or explosion. But when he finally lifted his head, his voice was low, rough, and shaken. "I shouldn't have hit you," he said. I don't know why his voice broke. "I'm sorry, kiddo. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. But it was real." The apology hung in the air like a fragile truce. I let it settle, let it breathe. And for the first time in a long time, I believed he meant it. For a long moment after my father's apology, none of us spoke. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the old refrigerator humming behind me, a sound I'd heard my entire childhood but never really noticed until that morning. Maybe it was because everything else felt different now. My place in that room. My father's expression. Even the silence between us. Something had cracked open, and none of us seemed sure what to do with the pieces. Dad wiped a hand over his face like he was trying to rub away years of stubbornness. I didn't sleep much, he muttered. Kept thinking about things. What things? I asked. Not accusing, not pushing, just asking. He cleared his throat. Your mom. What she'd say if she saw me last night. That hit deep. For years, Mom had been the glue, the calmer of storms, the woman who could coax a smile out of Dad when nobody else could. Her absence still lived in this house like a ghost no one talked about. Dad swallowed again, eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden table. She'd be disappointed. I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded, letting him feel the weight of his own words. Marcus finally reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. He didn't interrupt. He never rushed people, never filled silence with unnecessary words. That was something I'd learned early on. He listened like someone who understood the worst moments of people's lives without needing every detail spelled out. My father looked up at him suddenly. You said you're in federal service, he said. What does that mean? I felt a twinge of tension. Dad had asked this before, months ago, and Marcus had given the same answer. Vague, careful, not secretive, but intentional. I analyze threats, Marcus said simply. Patterns, people, behaviors, situations that could turn dangerous. Dad snorted. That could mean anything. It could, Marcus agreed. But it's the truth. I stepped forward slightly, arms crossed. Dad, you don't need to know every detail of his job. He frowned. I'm your father. It's normal I'd want to know who you're marrying. Then get to know him, I said gently. Not his job. But Dad wasn't finished. You talk like a cop, he said to Marcus. Or military. Or, his eyes narrowed. Are you one of those alphabet soup agencies? Marcus didn't look rattled. I work where I'm needed. That answer, though vague, was honest. And in a strange way, that honesty unsettled Dad more than any specific badge or title could have. Because my father knew, maybe from his years as a firefighter, maybe from instincts older than either of us, that the most dangerous men weren't the loud ones in uniform. They were the quiet ones. The ones who didn't brag. The ones who watched everything. Dad leaned back slowly. So, he said, voice lower, you're someone who sees through people. Marcus held his gaze. I try to understand them. And what do you understand about me? Dad asked, trying for sarcasm, but his voice cracked slightly. Marcus didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, it was soft. Almost gentle. I see a man who loved his family. A man who worked hard, who sacrificed more than most people know. A man who never learned how to ask for help. A man who lost his wife and didn't know how to grieve. And a man who doesn't want to be left behind. My father stared at him, stunned. He looked like someone had read his diary aloud. I felt my throat tighten. Marcus had once told me that pain doesn't always look like crying. It often looks like anger, bitterness, withdrawal. But hearing him say it to my father, in this kitchen where so many arguments had lived, it struck deeper than I expected. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. Do you think I'm a bad man? No, Marcus said. I think you're a hurting man. And hurting people hurt others. Dad's jaw worked for a moment, like he was swallowing emotions he hadn't let himself feel in years. I didn't mean to hit her, he murmured. Her wedding, her choices, everything's changing so fast. I'm not ready. I'm not leaving you, I said quietly. I'm just building something new. That doesn't mean you lose me. He looked at me then. Really looked. As if seeing not his disobedient daughter, but a grown woman. Someone capable, steady, worth respecting. You deserve better than what I've been, he admitted, voice rough. That's why we're here, Marcus said. So you have a chance to be better. Dad pressed his hands together, elbows on the table. And what are you expecting from me? What do you want? Marcus's answer was simple. A father who shows up. Dad blinked several times, almost confused. That's all? That's everything, I said softly. Dad exhaled shakily, like someone lifting a weight they'd carried for years. I can try, he whispered. Marcus nodded once. That's all we ask. My father hesitated, then cleared his throat. You love my daughter? With my whole life, Marcus said without hesitation. There was something in the way he said it, steady, certain, without fluff, that made even my father believe him. Dad looked down at his hands, then back at Marcus. I wasn't good at being a husband. I don't want her to end up with someone who. She won't, Marcus said quietly. I'm not perfect, but I won't hurt her. Not like that. My father's eyes misted again. This time, he didn't hide it. Then maybe you're the right man for her. Marcus extended his hand across the table. Not demanding, not triumphant, just offering. Dad stared at it for a long moment before finally placing his weathered hand in Marcus's. A handshake, a truce, a beginning. In that moment, something finally softened in our home. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in years, someone had broken the cycle. And maybe Dad realized it too. Because when he released Marcus's hand, he whispered, "Thank you for loving her." I pressed my fingers to my lips, swallowing the sting of unexpected emotion. And for the first time in a very long time, the kitchen didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like hope. For a moment after that fragile handshake, the three of us just sat there, suspended in a kind of uneasy peace. Not healed, not whole, just paused, like we were all waiting to see whether the smallest movement would break whatever gentle thread was holding things together. I finally breathed out and pushed off the counter. The adrenaline from the morning was fading, and the bruise on my cheek pulsed with a dull, blooming ache. I could see Dad noticing it again, like each glance was another reminder of what he'd done and what he had almost become. Without speaking, I walked over to the old farmhouse sink and began rinsing the skillet I'd used earlier. I didn't do it to avoid them. I did it to steady myself. The motions were familiar. Turn faucet, angle pan, scrub, the same circles I'd scrubbed since I was tall enough to reach this sink. Sometimes muscle memory is the only thing that keeps you from breaking. Behind me, I heard my father shift in his chair. You really didn't sleep?" he asked Marcus. "No," Marcus said. "I stayed awake thinking about how to approach this the right way." Dad huffed a sad little laugh. "The right way? Haven't had much of that in this house lately." I set the skillet down a little harder than I meant to, water splashing over my hands. "Dad," I said softly, turning toward him. "We're not here to punish you. But we can't pretend things are fine." He couldn't look at me at first. His gaze stayed fixed on the table. On the two plates. The two glasses. The breakfast for two that had never really been intended for him at all. His voice came out tired. "I know." I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked slowly toward the table. I sat down in the empty chair beside Marcus. Dad's eyes flicked up, taking in the three of us arranged around the table like some strange family meeting. He cleared his throat. "I already apologized," he said. "What more do you want me to say?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shame him. I just spoke the truth, the kind I'd held inside for more years than I wanted to admit. "It's not about the apology," I said. "It's about the pattern." Dad didn't move. "You don't see what it's been like for me," I continued. "Every time I stood up for myself, every time I made a choice you didn't agree with, you made me feel like I was wrong just for trying to grow." He bristled, but Marcus gently touched my hand, grounding me. I continued. "When Mom died, you crumbled. And I get that. I do. But you didn't just grieve. You turned our home into a place where anger lived. And I've spent years tiptoeing around it." Dad's face tightened, but he still didn't speak. "I stopped bringing friends over because I never knew which version of you they would meet. I stopped sharing good news because you'd twist it into a lecture about responsibility. I stopped asking for your opinion because it was never an opinion. It was an order." Now his eyes lifted to mine, raw, unguarded. "And last night," I said, my voice shaking just slightly, "you hit me. To you it was a moment of anger. To me it was a line you can't uncross." Dad pressed his fingertips hard into the table. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I said gently. "But meaning doesn't undo it." The kitchen fell quiet again. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Sir," he said, not harsh, not confrontational, "she's not attacking you. She's telling you what the last several years have felt like for her." Dad swallowed hard. "I didn't realize I made things that bad." "You didn't want to realize it," I said. "There's a difference." He exhaled shakily, his shoulders sagging. For the first time, he looked like a man facing the truth instead of avoiding it. His voice broke. "I didn't want to lose you." "You weren't losing me," I whispered. "You were pushing me away." His head dropped into his hands. I'd seen my father strong. I'd seen him reckless. I'd seen him cruel, but I had never seen him look defeated. "Kiddo," he said, voice muffled. "I don't want you to think I'm some kind of monster." "You're not," I said quickly. "But you're hurting. And you've been taking it out on me for years." He lifted his head slowly. His eyes were wet, rims red. I didn't know how to stop. I reached across the table, and Marcus released my hand so I could take my father's. His palm was rough, warm, trembling. "We can't change the past," I said softly. "But we can choose the future." Dad squeezed my hand. "I want to choose better." Marcus nodded in quiet support. "Then start by supporting the woman your daughter has become." Dad blinked at him, throat working. "She became a good woman," he said. "Better than I deserved." I smiled faintly. "I learned that from Mom." Dad's face crumpled for a second. Grief rising like a tide he couldn't hold back. But he let it come this time. Not buried. Not denied. He sat with it. Let it show. That alone was more progress than I ever thought I'd see. "Your fiancé," Dad said, turning toward Marcus. He seems like a good man. Honest. Patient. "He is," I said. "And he sees me, values me, treats me like I matter." Dad closed his eyes, pain twisting his features. "I never meant to make you feel like you didn't. But you did," I said gently. "And now we're here." He nodded slowly. "I want to fix things. I don't know how, but I want to." Marcus leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "Start by being there in 3 days," he said. Not as the loudest man in the room. Not as someone trying to control the moment. Just as her father. Dad looked down at our joined hands, then back up at me. "If you'll have me, we want you there," I said. "But we can't pretend everything's perfect. You have to meet us halfway." His voice cracked. "I'll try." "That's enough," Marcus said. And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. Not erased. Not forgotten. But loosened. There was space now for something new to grow. Something that felt a lot like healing. My father didn't say anything for a long while after that talk. He sat hunched over the table, elbows pressed into the wood, fingers knit together like he was holding himself in place. I watched him breathe, the uneven rise and fall of a man who had spent years pretending he didn't feel a thing. Now every buried emotion was flooding to the surface, faster than he could control it. Marcus stayed quiet beside me, giving space. That was something I had always admired about him, his ability to stand strong without filling silence just to make himself comfortable. He let people arrive at their truth in their own time. Finally, Dad exhaled a shaky breath and pushed himself back in the chair. The motion was slow, deliberate, as though he were afraid he might break under his own weight. "I wasn't always like this," he said quietly. I swallowed. "I know." "No," he insisted, lifting his eyes to mine. "You don't." "Not really." He rubbed the side of his face, the skin around his eyes worn from years of squinting in smoke, wind, and anger. "You grew up seeing the end of it. The worst of it. But you didn't see the beginning." His voice drifted, as if he were pulling memories from a place he'd avoided for too long. "I used to be proud of myself," he said. "Proud of what I did. Proud of the people I helped." He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had saved strangers, fixed broken things, and yes, hurt me. "Your old man wasn't just some grouch who yelled about chores and respect. I fought fires. I ran into burning buildings when everyone else was running out." I nodded slowly. This part of him was familiar but distant, something he rarely spoke about anymore. He stared past us, as if watching flames from years ago. "I saw things most people never see. Pulled bodies out of wrecks. Watched houses collapse. Listened to people scream for help I couldn't always give." He swallowed hard. "I brought some of that home with me." My chest tightened. "Dad." He shook his head. "I'm not making excuses. Just telling you what happened." Marcus leaned forward slightly, listening with quiet respect. "Your mom knew," Dad said. "She could see how heavy it was. Every year it got worse. Every time something bad happened on the job, part of me dimmed." He blinked slowly, eyes unfocused. "And when I hurt my back during that warehouse collapse, they forced me to retire. Just like that. One day I was someone. The next day I wasn't." The bitterness in his voice wasn't sharp. Just deeply sad. "Your mom tried to help me adjust," he continued. "She begged me to talk to someone. To get help. But I told her real men didn't need therapy. That I could handle it." His lips curled into a humorless smile. "Turns out I couldn't." He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under the weight of memories. "When she passed, I lost the only person who ever called out my worst parts without making me feel like a failure. And without her." He shook his head. "I didn't know how to be your father anymore." My heart ached, hearing him say that. I'd always assumed he was simply too proud or too stubborn to change. I never considered he might have been lost. "You were just a kid," he whispered. "And instead of protecting you, I put the burden on you to protect me." Tears burned behind my eyes. For years, I had carried guilt about leaving home, about choosing my own life instead of managing his moods. Hearing him say it out loud, clearly, Felt like someone opening a window in a room I didn't realize had gone dark. You were so much like your mother, he continued, voice trembling. Strong, kind, steady, but every time I looked at you, it reminded me she was gone. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed but not hiding it, and I hated myself for that. Hated that I couldn't be the man she believed I was. He looked at me then. Really looked. I took that out on you. And I'm ashamed of it. Deeply ashamed. A tear finally slipped down my cheek. He didn't look away. Marcus reached over and placed his hand gently on my back. His presence grounded me, kept me from collapsing under the weight of everything my father had finally said. I never knew how much you were carrying, I whispered. You weren't supposed to, Dad said, shaking his head. I was supposed to be the strong one. The protector. He let out a harsh breath. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being a father and started being a storm you had to navigate. The truth hit hard because it was accurate. That was exactly what my childhood had felt like. Weathering Dad's moods, his silence, his sharp words, his unpredictable anger. Marcus finally spoke. Sir, he said gently, pain doesn't justify hurting others. But acknowledging it, that's where change begins. Dad nodded slowly. I know. And last night, when I slapped her, I realized I'd become someone she couldn't trust. Someone I wouldn't recognize if I saw him from the outside. I pressed my fingers to the bruise on my cheek, feeling the sting of both pain and understanding. I never wanted to be my worst self, he whispered. But I let my grief, my pride, and my fear turn me into that man. And you're not him anymore, I said softly. You're here, you're trying. He looked at me with a mix of hope and doubt. Do you really believe I can change? Yes, I said. But it won't happen in one morning. It'll take time, effort, humility, and you'll have to show us, not just say it. He nodded, taking the words in. I can do that, he said. I want to do that. Marcus leaned back, satisfied. Then we'll meet you halfway. Dad exhaled shakily, a breath that seemed to carry years of regret. Then he straightened a little in his chair. I want to be at the wedding, he said. I want to be the father you deserve when you walk down that aisle. Emotion clogged my throat. Then be that man, I whispered. Starting today, he nodded again, more firmly this time. I will, and for the first time in years, I believed him. The morning moved slowly after that talk, as if the house itself needed time to adjust to what had just happened inside its walls. The sun climbed higher, casting long stripes of light across the kitchen floor. Dust floated through the beams like tiny drifting memories, settling on the table where forgiveness had been spoken for the first time in years. Dad sat there quietly, not fidgeting, not pacing, not storming off. Just thinking. I had never seen him sit still this long without anger simmering beneath the surface. Whatever wall he had carried for decades had cracked, letting in a sliver of something softer. Something almost unfamiliar. Marcus finally rose from his chair, stretching slightly. We should give you some time, he said gently to my father. We've said what needed to be said. Dad nodded, his voice strained. I appreciate that. I stood too, but Dad reached out and lightly touched my hand, not gripping, not demanding, just asking me to stay a moment longer. Could you two wait a minute? He asked, glancing at Marcus, then at me. There's something I want to say to just my daughter. Marcus's expression showed he understood completely. Of course, he said, stepping out into the living room. I turned back to Dad, unsure what to expect. He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice low and hesitant. Kiddo, I know you're getting married in 3 days, and I know things have been strained. But I want you to hear this from me, before anything else. I slowly sat down again. I'm proud of you, he said. The words were so unexpected, I almost didn't register them. I haven't said it enough. Maybe I haven't said it at all. His chin trembled, but he didn't look away. You grew into a strong woman. Stronger than me in a lot of ways. And you picked a good man, good enough that he was willing to stand up for you when I didn't. I felt tears sting my eyes. You deserve happiness, he said. You deserve a wedding day that isn't overshadowed by my mistakes. It won't be, I whispered. Not if you're there as the father I know you can be. He swallowed, nodding slowly. I want to be that man. I really do. Then start today, I said gently. Come to the wedding not because it's expected, but because you want to celebrate with me. Dad let out a shaky breath. I want that more than you know. I stood and hugged him. Not the quick, awkward hug we'd exchanged at holidays, but a longer one where his shoulders sagged against me and his breath hitched in a way that told me he needed that moment more than he'd ever admit. When I stepped back, he wiped his eyes. Let me clean myself up, he murmured. I need a minute. Marcus walked back in from the living room as Dad retreated down the hallway toward his bedroom. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Better than expected." He cupped my cheek gently, careful of the bruise. "I'm proud of you." I leaned into his hand. "I couldn't have done this without you." He smiled softly. "We're partners. Always." The rest of the morning passed quietly. We helped Dad tidy up the kitchen, Marcus washing dishes, me drying, Dad wiping down the counters with the same focus he used to have when cleaning his gear after a shift at the firehouse. It felt symbolic somehow. Like we were all trying to put things back in order. Eventually, Marcus and I headed home to prepare for the upcoming wedding tasks, final fittings, cake samples, last-minute details that had been overshadowed by the tension with Dad. But that night, lying in bed with a gentle lamp glow on the nightstand, I stared up at the ceiling and replayed everything: the slap, the fear, the breakfast, the apology, the truth, the hope. I wanted to believe my father's change would stick. But a part of me knew that healing wasn't a straight line. It was a long road with setbacks and breakthroughs, with moments of courage and moments of weakness. Still, I had seen something in his eyes that morning, something real. The next day, Marcus and I picked up my wedding dress from the boutique downtown. As I carried the garment bag to the car, I realized my stomach wasn't tight with dread anymore. For the first time in months, I felt light. I felt like a bride. Not a mediator, not a caretaker, not a daughter walking on eggshells. Later that evening, while Marcus was on a call with one of his colleagues, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. "Can we talk tomorrow?" Just us. My first instinct was fear. Old habits die hard, but then I read the message again. There was no edge to it. No command. No guilt-laden demand. Just a simple request. I replied, yes. The next morning, we met at a small diner on the edge of town. It was a place Mom used to love, the kind with sticky syrup bottles and waitresses who called you sweetheart. Dad was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, wearing his old button-down shirt, hair combed back. He stood when he saw me. That alone brought a lump to my throat. When we sat, he took a deep breath. "I want to be at the wedding," he said. "But I know I can't just show up and pretend everything's perfect. So I'm here to ask for your permission. And your forgiveness." I stared at him, searching his eyes. He continued, voice trembling. "I can't promise I'll never slip, or get frustrated, or say the wrong thing. But I can promise I'll work at it. I'll get help. I'll talk to someone if that's what it takes. I'm not losing you. Not again." Tears welled in my eyes, but I forced myself to breathe. "Dad, I want you there. I want you to walk me down the aisle. But only if you come as the father who sat at that kitchen table yesterday. Not the man who slapped me the night before." He nodded slowly. "That's the man I want to be." We held hands across the table, and in that moment, something inside me finally loosened. The fear, the resentment, the old grief. Maybe forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a series of choices. And this was one of them. 3 days felt like both a blink and a lifetime. But when the wedding morning arrived, I stood in front of the mirror in my white dress and felt ready. Truly ready. My bridesmaids, Jess, who'd flown in from Portland, and my cousin Sarah, bustled around me, adjusting the veil, fixing my makeup, making sure every detail was perfect. "You look beautiful," Jess said, her eyes glistening. "You really do," Sarah agreed. "Marcus is going to lose it when he sees you." I smiled, but my mind was somewhere else. On the conversation that still needed to happen. On the man who was supposed to walk me down the aisle but might not show. Then I heard a knock at the door. My heart jumped. Jess opened it. My father stood there, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing the suit he'd bought years ago for a ceremony he never attended because he was too grief-stricken after Mom's funeral. He looked different somehow, softer, present. He held a small velvet box. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. "Of course," I said. Jess and Sarah exchanged glances, then quietly slipped out to give us privacy. Dad stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. For a moment, he just looked at me, really looked, and his eyes filled with tears. "You look just like her," he whispered. "Your mother." On our wedding day. I touched the fabric of my dress, emotion rising in my throat. He opened the velvet box with trembling hands. Inside was my mother's pendant, silver, heart-shaped, engraved with her initials. I hadn't seen it in years. "Dad had kept it all this time. She wanted you to have this," he said, voice breaking. "On your wedding day. I should have given it to you sooner, but I couldn't. I wasn't ready to let her go." Tears streamed down my face. "Dad, I'm ready now," he said. "To let her rest. To let you live. To be the father she would have wanted me to be. He fastened the pendant around my neck, his hands shaking but steady enough. When he stepped back, he looked at me with such raw love and regret that it took my breath away. "May I walk you down the aisle?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. I smiled through my tears. "Yes, Dad, you may." The church smelled like old pine pews and polished floors, the kind of scent you only get in small-town American churches that have stood longer than most of the people sitting in them. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, scattering colors across the aisle, reds and blues and golds that danced on the worn wooden floor. As I stepped inside on my father's arm, every head turned, but I didn't look at them. I looked at him. He held himself upright, shoulders squared but not rigid, as though he understood the weight of this moment. His grip on my arm wasn't controlling, wasn't possessive. It was steady, supportive. For the first time since I was a child, I felt his presence as something protective rather than suffocating. "You look like your mother," he whispered, voice trembling. "So do you," I murmured back. He let out a shaky breath, eyes glistening. "I'm glad you let me do this. I'm glad you asked," I said. We took another step, then another, each one echoing through the sanctuary like the soft beat of a new beginning. I could feel his nerves, his remorse, his quiet pride, all woven together in the way he held on to me. Not tightly, not loosely, but with the kind of care that comes from realizing how close you came to losing something irreplaceable. At the altar, Marcus stood waiting. His dress uniform was perfect, his posture strong, but when our eyes met, I saw the emotion there, the love, the relief, the joy. When we reached the front, Dad stopped. He held my hand just a second longer before placing it into Marcus's. "Take care of her," he said softly. Marcus nodded. "Always." And then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including me, my father placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "And let me know if I ever forget how to be her father." His voice cracked. "I'll work at it, I promise." Marcus squeezed his shoulder. "We'll walk forward together." Dad stepped back, swiping at his eyes, and found a seat in the front row. I saw him fold his hands, sit straight, and breathe, as though the weight of years had finally loosened from his chest. The ceremony felt like a dream. Simple, heartfelt, filled with the warmth of family and friends who had watched me grow up in this town. When Marcus and I said our vows, I didn't tremble or falter. The words came naturally, flowing from a place of deep certainty. "I promise to stand with you," I said, looking into Marcus's eyes. "In strength and in weakness. In joy and in sorrow. To build a home where love is louder than fear. Where honesty is stronger than pride. Where we choose each other, every single day." Marcus's voice was steady, but I could hear the emotion underneath. "I promise to see you. To value you. To protect you, not by controlling you, but by standing beside you. To be your partner, your equal, your home. Today and every day after." When the officiant pronounced us married, Marcus kissed me gently, and the church erupted in applause. But the moment that mattered most came after. When my father stood and clapped louder than anyone, tears streaming down his face, smiling like the man I remembered from childhood. The man my mother had loved. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, decorated with simple elegance, white lights strung across the ceiling, mason jars filled with wildflowers, tables covered in cream-colored linens. It wasn't fancy, but it was us. Dad stayed close but didn't hover. He talked to old neighbors, hugged my friends, even apologized to a few people he'd been harsh with over the years. It was like watching the man he used to be slowly make his way back to the surface, bit by bit. At one point, he approached Marcus and me as we stood near the patio, where fairy lights twinkled between the trees. "I want to say something," he said, clearing his throat. "If that's all right." Marcus nodded kindly. "Of course." Dad looked at both of us, then, much to my surprise, gestured for attention from the small cluster of guests nearby. When a hush fell over the group, he took a breath that shook a little at the end. "I wasn't the man I should have been," he began. "Not to my daughter. Not to myself." He paused, letting the words settle. "I made mistakes. More than I care to admit. But seeing her today, seeing the woman she's become, reminded me that it's never too late to try to make things right." His eyes met mine, shining with something honest and painfully human. "I'm proud of you," he said, voice cracking. "I'm proud of the life you're making. And I'm proud you chose someone who sees your worth, even when I didn't." A soft murmur passed through the guests. Even Marcus blinked hard. Dad wiped his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me a second chance." I stepped forward and hugged him tightly, letting the moment soak into my bones. It wasn't forgiveness all at once. It was a beginning, and beginnings, I'd learned, can be just as powerful as endings. Later that night, after the music faded and guests began drifting toward their cars, I found Dad standing alone near the edge of the lawn, watching the lights dance across the pond. He looked peaceful, tired, hopeful, humbled. "Hey," I said gently, coming to stand beside him. "Hey," he whispered back. "You did really well today." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Didn't think I had it in me." "You did," I assured him. He turned toward me. "I'm going to keep working at it, kiddo. Getting help, being better. I want you to be proud of me too." My heart softened at the vulnerability in his eyes. "I already am," he sniffed, wiping his eyes one last time. "Your mom would have loved this day." "She's here," I said softly. "She's always been here." We stood quietly for a while, listening to the frogs at the water's edge and the distant laughter of the last remaining guests. The world felt still, grounded, whole. "I love you, Dad," I said. "I love you too," he answered, voice breaking. More than I ever managed to show. When Marcus and I finally drove off that night, my hand resting in his, I looked back through the window. Dad was still standing where I'd left him, one hand raised in a gentle wave. He looked smaller somehow, but also lighter, brighter, human. And I realized then that revenge wasn't always about making someone pay. Sometimes it was about forcing the truth into the open. About breaking cycles. About letting the light in, even through the cracks. For me, the revenge wasn't the confrontation, it was the healing that followed. The kind that made us better than the people we used to be. The coffee shop in our neighborhood has become our Saturday morning ritual. Marcus and I sit by the window, watching the world wake up. Joggers passing by, dog walkers stopping to chat, the bakery across the street opening its doors to the first customers of the day. My phone buzzes. A text from Dad. "Still on for dinner tonight? I'm making pot roast. Your favorite." I smile and text back. "Wouldn't miss it." 5 years since that morning in the kitchen. 5 years since Marcus sat my father down and drew a line in the sand. 5 years since everything changed. Dad kept his promise. He went to therapy, joined a support group for retired first responders dealing with trauma and grief. Started volunteering at the fire station again, teaching kids about safety, reconnecting with the work that once gave him purpose. He stopped drinking. Started exercising. Found a community at church that didn't just see the gruff exterior but understood the man beneath. And slowly, piece by piece, he became the father I'd always needed. Not perfect. He still has hard days. Days when the grief over mom resurfaces, when the old anger tries to creep back in. But now he calls me. He talks about it. He asks for help instead of lashing out. Marcus and I visit him twice a month. We have dinner, play cards, talk about everything and nothing. Dad asks about Marcus's work, carefully, respectfully, understanding now that some things aren't his to know. And Marcus asks about Dad's week, his health, his volunteer work. They've become friends. Real friends. Last year, when Marcus was offered a promotion that would have required us to move across the country, Dad was the first person to tell us to take it. "Don't hold back your life for me," he'd said. "I'll be fine. And you can always come home." We didn't take it. Not because of Dad, but because we'd built a life here. A home. But knowing he would have supported us, that meant everything. 2 months ago, Dad met someone. A woman named Linda who volunteers at the library, a widow who lost her husband to cancer 3 years back. She's kind, patient, loves mystery novels and terrible puns. When Dad told me about her, he was nervous. Like a teenager asking permission. "I don't want you to think I'm replacing your mom," he'd said. "I don't," I told him gently. "I think you're letting yourself live again. Mom would want that." He'd cried then. The good kind of tears. Last week, he brought Linda to our house for dinner. She was warm, genuine, and she laughed at Dad's stories. The good ones, the ones about his firefighting days, the ones that reminded us all who he used to be before grief tried to bury him. Watching them together, seeing Dad smile like that, I felt something settle in my chest. A final piece of healing clicking into place. Tonight, when we go to Dad's for dinner, Linda will be there too. And afterward, Dad's going to show Marcus the old photo albums, the ones from before I was born, when he and Mom were young and everything felt possible. Marcus will listen. He always does. And Dad will tell stories, his voice steady, his eyes clear, free from the shadows that once lived there. And I'll sit between them, my hand in Marcus's, watching my father be the man he fought so hard to become. Later, when we're driving home under a sky full of stars, Marcus will ask if I'm happy. And I'll say yes. Because I am. Not because everything is perfect, but because we chose to fight for something better. Because we refused to let pain become a legacy. Because we broke the cycle and built something new from the broken pieces. That morning in the kitchen, the bruise on my cheek, the fear in my father's eyes, the quiet strength in Marcus's voice. It changed everything. It gave us all a chance to start again, and sometimes, that's the greatest revenge of all. Not punishment. Not cruelty. Just truth, accountability, and the courage to demand better, for yourself. For the people you love. For the life you deserve to build. If you've ever carried hurt from someone you love, I hope you find your healing too. And if this story touched something in you, feel free to share it, reflect on it, or subscribe for more stories like this. Stories about redemption, resilience, and the quiet bravery it takes to start again.